key leadership from the Environmental Protection Agency here today. I am standing in for Dr. Christy Pullen-Fednick. I'm Christy Ellickson, also doctor at the Union of Concerned Scientists. And since we sit here today in September in the year of 2023, I went through and looked up some events in environmental justice that happened in the month of September, and it's a big month. So in September of 1982, strategic and brave folks were protesting a landfill of PCB contaminated materials in Warren County in North Carolina, which is seen by many as an initiation event. During September of 1993, the then EPA administrator announced the creation of the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, or the NEJAC, and they were charged and are still charged with providing advice to EPA from an environmental justice perspective. And in September of 2011, Plan EJ 2014 was published. It set up a list of plans that the EPA would implement, including cross-agency plans for integrating environmental justice into permitting, compliance and enforcement, rulemaking, and community-based actions. There's a lot more. The list is not even close to being done, but we have several leaders here today. Others, I believe, will be joining us. First, I am going to introduce Dr. Chris Frey, who is the Assistant Administrator for the Office of Research and Development at EPA, and he has a presentation. So thanks.
Thank you, Christy. I think I may need help from someone to put that presentation up. And great, excellent. Thank you so much. Well, it's really a pleasure to be here at this very important 9th Annual University of Maryland Symposium on Environmental Justice and Health Disparities. And I will say, when I came on board to EPA in February of 2021, one of my first meetings was with Jacoby Wilson. And I think all of you know Jacoby, appreciate his thought leadership. And he gave me a lot of advice. And I think a lot of what I'm going to report out is related to advice that he's provided, but also, of course, related to advice that we have heard from the NEJAC that Christy alluded to, the National Environmental Justice Council, and also a lot of engagements that we've been doing. So I'm going to talk about the environmental justice research priorities for EPA's Office of Research and Development. And if you're not familiar with our office, so you're probably familiar with the program offices, and my colleague Cliff Villa will speak from one of the national regulatory program offices. But a lot of people don't know that EPA has a research and development office. And our mission is to develop and translate science to inform decisions. And we do this by developing scientific products according to well-established methods and scientific integrity, and translating that into a form that's actionable by decision makers, both within the agency, including colleagues such as Cliff, and with the EPA regional offices, and also for states, tribes, local governments, and communities. In developing our research agenda, we go through a fairly rigorous process of seeking input to inform identification of research needs for our partners. And we went through a process in 2021, culminating in, beginning in 21, culminating in a strategic research action plan published at the end of in September 2022, which is the end of our fiscal year. And as part of that, we identified cross-cutting research priorities for ORD. And I'm just going to talk briefly about 3 of these: environmental justice, cumulative impacts, and climate change, but also note that we also have cross-cutting research on community resilience, children's health, and contaminants of immediate and emerging concern. With regard to environmental justice, our focus is on research to identify, characterize, and solve environmental problems where they are most acute in and with communities that are most at risk and the least resilient. And there's several prongs of our environmental justice research focus, including developing methods and tools to identify and prioritize community concerns. It's very important that we address the needs of communities, that we characterize environmental health disparities, and we assess cumulative impacts of contamination, climate change, and other stressors. And then we develop science to support effective interventions aimed at improving the health, well-being, and quality of life of overburdened communities. So I briefly mentioned cumulative impacts. In 2021 and 2022, we developed a report to identify research needs and cumulative impacts. And as part of that, we offer the following definition, which is that cumulative impacts are the totality of exposures to combinations of chemical and non-chemical stressors, including social determinants of health, and their combined effect on health, well-being, and quality of life outcomes. And cumulative impact assessment is a process of evaluating both quantitative and qualitative data representing cumulative impacts. And this includes place-based data and data provided by communities. The research report I mentioned that we published in September of 2022 on cumulative impacts research recommendations for the Office of Research and Development has framed our research agenda on cumulative impacts. And we received we sought quite a bit of input on this from states, tribes, local agencies, national associations, the EPA program offices in regions, community members, and the EPA Science Advisory Board. So our cumulative impacts research agenda includes development and application of models, methods, and tools to assess cumulative impacts and to do cumulative impact assessment with the goal of addressing adverse as well as beneficial effects. And our ultimate goal is to improve the health, well-being, and quality of life of communities by identifying ways to intervene to reduce adverse effects, but also ways to amplify beneficial effects. An example could be green infrastructure. On top of the longstanding challenges of overburdened communities, we're at a nexus in history with a rapidly changing climate. And I think, as we all know, climate change is exacerbating disparities and is particularly addressing frontline overburdened and underserved communities to a greater extent than many other communities. And so our research agenda recognizes this and is focused on identifying scientific methods, tools, data to reduce environmental and health disparities and to respond to impacts of climate change. As part of this, we've created some new programs within our office. One is an interdisciplinary climate assessment program that's looking to quantitatively assess the damages from climate change. What is the effect of climate change on human health and on ecosystem health? And also, we've created a regional climate assistance network that is intended to develop assessments and provide technical support and capacity building for adaptation planning and resilience with a focus on frontline communities most vulnerable to climate change impacts. In leaning into this research agenda, we also recognized early in the planning process that this kind of work requires an interdisciplinary approach. And ORD is traditionally strong in the physical, chemical, biological, computational sciences, as well as engineering. And we have had social scientists for quite some time, but we recognize that we need to bolster our social science expertise to deal with effectively and appropriately with community engagement, partnerships, development of holistic data and information, including qualitative information and information regarding cultural knowledge, local knowledge, and traditional ecological knowledge, as well as how to effectively and sustainably empower individuals and communities to implement solutions and to evaluate the effectiveness of those solutions. Related to environmental justice science is the importance of engaging the community in the development of not just identifying the problems to be addressed through science, but to work collaboratively in developing the science. And so EPA envisions a future where all parts of society help advance scientific knowledge that inform environmental protection through participatory science. And the goal here is to provide accessible, actionable information that informs decision-making at various levels. And so we've also developed a number of resources and are continuing to do that in the coming years. Another initiative that I'm really proud of in the Office of Research and Development is a partnership with EPA's Region 2 to form a community-engaged research collaborative for learning and excellence, which we call CIRCLE. And this is based at our Edison, New Jersey campus, which is in the New York, New Jersey metro area and proximate to many overburdened communities. So this is an opportunity for us to develop our processes, procedures, protocols, methodologies, and tools to build long-lasting, trusting relationships with overburdened communities, develop the approaches to connect community challenges, to reach back into ORD, to our science, to support joint research studies in and with communities, to conduct STEM outreach, and to share results widely to build capacity within EPA as well as in the scientific community. I also want to briefly mention that EPA is just one of many agencies engaged in environmental justice and related research in science. Through the National Science and Technology Council, which is part of the Office of Science, Technology, and Policy of the White House. I'm actually a co-chair of the Committee on the Environment. And in the last year or two, we formed two subcommittees, one on air quality and community health, and the other on environmental justice science. And we have folks from EPA actively engaged with our friends across the federal family. So to wrap up my presentation, we develop science to inform decisions. Among our focus areas are environmental justice, cumulative impacts, and climate change. We've stood up some new programs to lean in to these priorities on climate assessment, climate assistance, participatory science, a community-engaged research collaborative. We're bolstering the social sciences to support these activities, and we're partnering with other members of the federal family. So, Christy, thanks so much. I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you. Thanks for that presentation. So next on our list of leadership from the Environmental Protection Agency is Katie Hansen, who is the Senior Technical Assistance Specialist at the Office of Water. You have a chance to share your screen.
Yes, it's just taking a moment as tech goes, and I think I should be up soon. Okay, one moment. All right. It's processing. Well, I can get going and saying thank you very much for having me today and for including the Office of Water. We're delighted to be supporting the environmental justice efforts of the EPA as a real central focus of our Office of Water leadership. And are the slides here? Okay, I think I should be close. Right. So when we think from the Office of Water, right, our main environmental justice concern is that there are many communities that are facing water infrastructure challenges. And we know that there are, unfortunately, over 2 million people who don't have access to safe, clean, reliable, affordable drinking water in the United States. And that's the main focus of our work. And are my slides still up? Sorry. They're lost. There we are. Right, so the bipartisan infrastructure law, of course, presented a huge opportunity for us to invest over $50 billion in water infrastructure. And the environmental justice component of this is really focused on ensuring that disadvantaged communities access these funds that are available through grants or forgivable loans. to invest in their water infrastructure. And there are 5 goals that the Office of Water is really focused on in implementing these programs to help communities access these funds. So the first is that targeting that I've said, and we'll continue to come back to. We're really laser focused on targeting resources towards disadvantaged communities and underserved communities. The second priority area is making rapid progress towards lead service line replacement and a lead-free water for all effort, and I'll talk a bit about that. The third is tackling forever chemicals and trying to address PFAS issues across the country. Fourth is supporting resilience, and that includes climate resilience and cybersecurity issues. And the fifth is trying to build and create good jobs. And the challenge is that we know many communities have been unable to access public funds for water infrastructure in the past. And what the Office of Water is focused on is providing technical assistance to help improve access to the funds in the bipartisan infrastructure law and other federal and state funds. So how does that work, right? Our Water TA program does several things. First, we help identify water challenges. So that is part of this session is thinking about the identification and reaching communities that would benefit from assistance. And there's proactive efforts to do so. And then really planning for how do we solve these issues with a focus on increasing community engagement. So we don't want it to be that engineers come into communities and are looking at assessing the problems without listening to the residents of the communities and the water utilities that serve them to ask what are the main issues and how do we prioritize addressing the lived experience challenges that the community faces. Building technical, financial, and managerial capacity is a big effort within Water TA, that we need operators and utilities and states that have the capacity to really run their systems and programs well. And so that is an effort. And then lastly, right, the technical assistance efforts are helping to develop the application materials to access the fund. Most of that $50 billion for water is allocated through the state revolving fund program, and states administer those funds, and utilities and communities need to apply for them. So our technical assistance efforts are focused on helping utilities do so. And I think this is really the money slide from an environmental justice symposium standpoint of saying, what are we doing to advance environmental justice? It's really these 3 approaches that are central to our water technical assistance work and water work, that we're really doing targeted work, right? And laser focused on underserved communities that might be struggling to access funding. And that is just our hourly task of thinking, how do we better focus our efforts? The second approach is to be more proactive, that instead of hoping that utilities and communities and residents that could benefit from the water infrastructure investments know about the program and know how to seek help and know how to apply, to really shift that burden and go to the folks that need it most. And thirdly, the third approach, right, is being more community-centered. So really working to move at the speed of trust in communities, where we start with listening and try to build the trust and address needs in a manner that is really community-centered and culturally competent. And so that's an important focus. All right, so what does this process actually look like? It's good to talk about approaches and principles, but brass tacks here. Communities request assistance for water technical assistance. They're connected with a water TA provider. TA is technical assistance, and that is coordinated with EPA, with states, and with the technical assistance providers. Then the technical assistance providers engage with the community in the manner that I just explained. That's listening first, culturally competent, to help assess and figure out solutions to address the challenges, and then applying for federal funding, especially through the bipartisan infrastructure bill. So the result of this is that there will be more applications for federal funding, which will lead to improved quality of life, public health, environment, right? We want water that's drinkable, that's fishable, that's swimmable as a result of these efforts. And we're so lucky to work with a real deep bench of water technical assistance providers that are doing this work. So I'm going to highlight a few of them quickly and then play an example of how this work is impacting communities. Well, as I get there, I think that we wanted to, in reflection of the year in review, just highlight how important collaboration has been, that we are successful because we are actively partnering with the state revolving fund programs, with tribes and territories, other federal agencies, local governments, and community groups, and that lens of partnership, trust building, empowerment, and listening first is essential to both living our environmental justice principles in practice and reaching the outcomes that we're seeking for. And that a lot of the work has been coordinating these various efforts among providers and states and regions so that we are stewarding resources well and avoiding duplication. And so these are sort of the day in, day out work that we're doing on this. Right, so who are these programs and programs? We are providing water TA, but there are different buckets in the back end that are focused on various priorities. So the lead service line replacement accelerators are working with 40 communities in 4 states to address lead service lines. So that's developing inventories and making plans for replacement and figuring out how to fund those programs. Closing America's Wastewater Access Gap was the pilot program that was launched in 2022 in 6 states and 2 tribal nations. And it's focused on decentralized wastewater challenges, which often are difficult to address. This is a well-known example of Miss Catherine Flowers in Alabama, working in Lowndes County with the administrator and the assistant administrator, working on how do we address the challenges in Lowndes County and another 10 communities. And the result of this work was developing community solutions plans, which are available for others to refer to and build off of. There's community solutions teams, which are 30 communities in the last year in over 20 states have received technical assistance through this real hands-on work. And they are taking initial steps towards applying. And I have, as I wrap up here, an example from Marv Hasso, who's the director for public works at the village of Akron, Michigan, who was one of these pilots and thought best to hear in his own words the impact of the program. So I'll see if the audio works. Please let me know if not. Oh. I think that didn't upload. Okay, so we'll move on and say the best way to get in touch with Office of Water to request water technical assistance support is through this request form, which is available online. And it's a very simple form. That's another important lesson of just creating easy on-ramps for communities to receive water technical assistance. And that's the website. And with that, I'll turn it back over. Thank you very much for your time and attention. It's great to be here.
Thank you so much. Our next presenter in this session is Cliff Villa, and he is the Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Office of Land and Emergency Management. Thanks for presenting.
Thank you. I am attempting to load a screen. Do you see a screen?
See it. Yeah, we see your slides.
Okay, great. All right, you still see slides? And we still have audio?
I can hear you and see you. Yes,
right.
Thanks.
Well, great. Let's get going. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Cliff Villa from the EPA Office of Land and Emergency Management. We are the EPA office that does things like Superfund cleanup and brownfields grants, solid and hazardous waste management, emergency management. This is a scene from the West Side Lead Superfund site in the west side of Atlanta, where we are cleaning up residential yards that are contaminated with lead. And I will come back to this story in just a little bit. A little bit about me. I'm talking to you from Washington, D.C., but I am born and raised in New Mexico. My family has lived in the area that's now Albuquerque for a very long time, since well before the United States was established. A lot of the places where I grew up playing look like this. This is Los Sardinas Institute in the South Valley of Albuquerque. If you know my friends Richard Moore and Sophia Martinez, this is their fine educational institution. But much of the southwest of South Valley of Albuquerque looked a lot like this. I remember playing in alfalfa fields as a kid. And then it started to develop a lot of heavy industry like asphalt plants and cement plants and refineries. And we started to get a lot more contamination, become sort of a classic EJ community. Those beautiful places growing up in New Mexico sort of led me to the interest in protecting places. And that led me to work for EPA after law school. I eventually found my way to EPA Region 10 based in Seattle and ended up doing a lot of work for our emergency response program. This is my office, a mobile lab and office in Eastern Washington, the Yakima Valley. And one day in 2007, we got a call about 2 boys in the hospital with acute mercury poisoning. And the problem for me as an attorney was that we're going door to door and people were not granting us access to go onto the property to do sampling for the mercury. And eventually I drove over the mountains to see what was going on. And sort of my whole life turned upside down when I realized that while I had always thought of EPA as being the good guys, from the perspective of this community, which was over 85% Spanish speaking, it looked like an invasion of feds into their community. And some people can have very different ways of looking at the government, even under the best of circumstances. So this is one of the big introductions for me thinking about environmental justice. I spent so much time thinking about environmental justice that eventually I left the agency in 2015 and went into academia back in my hometown of Albuquerque at the University of New Mexico. And I started doing a lot of research on environmental justice, particularly at the intersection of emergency response and disaster response. This is one of my research opportunities in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria in 2017, and really understanding how things like hurricanes can affect people differently, disproportionately. In this case, extreme disproportionate impacts on people with pre-existing heart disease and diabetes as the 2 leading factors of death. I did some research, I did some writing. This is one of the articles that sort of drew upon some of the research I had done in Puerto Rico, and then looking at the disproportionate effects of COVID-19 on race and ethnic groups as well, which were pretty extreme among indigenous communities and Black and Hispanic communities as well. And then something strange happened, that while I was happily teaching at UNM, I got called by the White House last year to come to DC and help lead policy on Superfund and emergency management and others. I had an invitation, like many others, to this great moment. This is the signing of a new executive order on environmental justice here in the Rose Garden. Very exciting to have the new executive order and a new definition of environmental justice that expands upon our sort of understanding of environmental justice, adding some new words like ability or disability. Disability, of course, being very significant in who lives and who dies in places like Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. More interesting words like engaging in cultural and subsistence practices. I'm thinking a lot about that in my work right now. What does it mean to engage in cultural subsistence practices? What does it mean to address those concerns? Here's one example of engaging in cultural practices. My office, the Office of Land and Emergency Management, is supporting a massive deployment right now for cleanup after the fires in Maui. We have at least 183 responders on the ground right now. And they're going property by property, cleaning out things like propane tanks and asbestos and lead. And before they began to do this work on the ground, they went through some pretty extensive cultural sensitivity training. And I think that is really paying off, working directly with community groups, Native Hawaiian groups, and others, so they could do the work effectively, but also respectfully, and make sure that we have a better conclusion to this work in the end. So we're thinking about cultural practices. We're thinking about subsistence practices. If you had said subsistence living to me 10 years ago, I might have thought about hunting caribou in the Arctic, or maybe fishing. I had no idea, even growing up in New Mexico, that there was a significant community support for subsistence hunting in northern New Mexico. This is the aftermath of fires last year. 2022 had the worst fires in the recorded history of New Mexico. And a lot of people lost things like mobile homes and cars and freezers full of meat, specifically elk meat that had been harvested the year before, and things that people would need to get through the next winter. So the more I spend thinking about these issues, the more I realize, of course, how much I have to learn, even subsistence hunting, even in my own home state. My office last year produced an EJ action plan to start thinking about specific things that we could do to promote environmental justice through our work. We had lots of public comment. We published the EJ action plan last fall, and we're now in the process of implementing a number of the actions in it. This is one I'm particularly proud of, and thank you to Matt Tejada and his office as well. We have a new policy on integrating environmental justice into emergency response, preparedness, and management, thinking about how we develop emergency response teams, making sure we have EJ advocates embedded within those organizational structures, making sure they have the training and awareness that they need to do their work. We're very excited about embedding environmental justice throughout our programs, even including emergency response. We've had a number of community engagement calls to talk about our EJ action plan. We've had over 300 people participate in these community engagement calls. I think the last one was here on June 8th. This is on our website of the EPA Office of Land and Emergency Management. It's a recorded webinar if you want to see what was going on. And I'm sure we're going to be having more community engagement calls as time goes on. My office, like other offices at EPA, has a vigorous regulatory agenda. We are developing proposed and final regulations and guidances. This is one regulation which has gone out and through public comment to make chemical facilities safer. We call the Safer Communities by Chemical Accident Prevention under the Risk Management Program of Clean Air Act, Section 112. So we should be getting a final rule coming out soon on that. We heard mention of PFAS. Of course, PFAS is at the top of the agenda for much work in EPA. We went out with a proposed rule to identify PFAS and PFOA as a hazardous substance that is subject to the federal Superfund law. We got over 60,000 public comments on that proposed rule, and we're working now to finalize a rule, hopefully later this year. We have proposed rules on dealing with coal combustion residuals. This is a lot of the aftermath of coal-fired power plants and others. Many of these historic landfills and dumps are sitting on the ground unprotected within the groundwater, and we are proposing to establish further regulations to address that. We've actually gone through public comment on this one and are looking forward to final rules in short order as well. We do, in fact, have some final rules. We got a final rule earlier this year for dealing with chemical dispersants. This is a lot of the concern that came out of things like the spill of the Deepwater Horizon in 2010, and people may recall the use of dispersants that was very controversial at that time. This is a final regulation that puts more boundaries and guidance on the use of dispersants and registration of future dispersants to come. So we have many proposed rules, some final rules, and guidances that may be very important for pursuing environmental justice as well. Last fall, we issued a strategy to reduce lead exposures in U.S. communities, which includes reducing lead from things like lead paint, but also just reducing lead in soil from whatever source you might find. We hope to have that final lead guidance out later this year. It will be our first guidance on lead levels since 1994. And we've certainly learned a lot about the toxicity of lead and the effects on developing brains in the past 30 years. Other parts of my office are working on things like, well, Superfund cleanup. We got, for the bipartisan infrastructure law, $5.4 billion on top of appropriations for clearing up a backlog of sites that have been waiting for funding and accelerating cleanups on other sites. We issued, we're now in the second year of bill funding. We put $1 billion out in cleanup year one, another $1 billion earlier this year to accelerate cleanup. One of the sites that received money this year was the site that was on the first slide of the deck. This is the West Side Lead Superfund site. This site was just listed on the national priorities list last year in 2022. And now here in 2023, it is already getting funding for cleanup. I got to visit the site in April, and it was great to see actual site cleanup happening right there. And they clean up yard by yard, getting things done much, much faster than they might have in the past. Another really exciting program that's funded by the bipartisan infrastructure law is a brownfields job training graduation. If I had to pick one coolest thing I've seen in my tenure now at EPA in the last year, it might be this one. We have a program that provides funding to nonprofit communities to provide job training for people to engage in things like remedial cleanup and management. People get certifications for health and safety and pesticide handling. On this day, we attended the graduation along with the deputy administrator who's pictured here, about 20 students. What's really exciting is that these moments are just transformative in so many ways. Many of the graduates were released from contamination, released from incarceration. Many were new citizens, and we're solving problems of not just environmental justice in many contexts, but social justice as well. We're putting out a lot of money on our brownfields program. We've had a brownfields grant program for 20 years, but we have significantly increased the funding for brownfields grants. Brownfields grants are going to states and tribes and local communities, really accelerating a lot of cleanup. Earlier this year, we announced $315 million that went out to 267 communities. We'll be announcing more brownfields grants or opening for brownfields grants later this fall, so please stay tuned. And finally, we got a whole new grant program for solid and hazardous waste, specifically for recycling programs, which might sound like an old idea, but we're really emphasizing the opportunity for diverting waste from landfills and creating what we call the circular economy. We will be announcing the first round of solid waste infrastructure for recycling grants, the Swiffer grant program, very, very soon. But what's exciting about this one, and responding to one of the comments in the chat, these grants will be going to states, all of them, but it will also be going to many communities across the country as well who may choose to apply for these grants independently. And so a lot of great work that's going to be transformative for managing solid waste and creating opportunities for recycling and management of food waste, composting, and others. So stay tuned for announcements on the Swiffer program coming very, very soon. Finally, I just want to add one last slide just to recognize that we have some profound challenges with contamination in this country, which creates profound cases of environmental injustice. This is one that has been particularly troubling for me for a long time. From my home state of New Mexico, this is on the Navajo Nation. This is the Redwater Pond Road community, where we have the legacy of uranium mining and milling for 50 years, and tribes that are unfairly burdened with tons of uranium mining waste. There's some real challenges of, if you dig it up, where do you move it to? Questions of, whose backyard? These are not easy questions, but this is one reason why I'm happy to be inside EPA and really wrestling with these questions. And I would welcome support, encouragement, questions from everybody who cares to wrestle with light questions as well. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll pass it on to the next speaker.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Matthew Tejada. You can share your screen if you have a presentation. He is the Deputy Assistant Administrator for Environmental Justice at the Environmental Protection Agency.
Thank you, Christy. Let me just pull up the right screen. Here we go. So hey everyone, thank you for having me on again. Name's Matthew Tejada. I'm the senior career official in charge of the EJ program at EPA. So regardless of things changing around me, including the title that goes on a business card that strangely people still ask for, even though I don't know what people do with them anymore. I'm still just kind of in the same job at EPA, running the EJ program. So wanted to start with a couple of things. I mean, obviously, and thanks to Cliff, he mentioned a few of these things already, just about the commitment of this administration on environmental justice. I don't think there's any clearer indication of that than the, I don't know how many you'd count, at least 4, maybe 15 executive orders that the president has signed that has something to do with equity, with environmental justice, with issues of diversity, inclusion, looking at issues of data, regulatory analyses. Equity and justice have been all over the place in this administration in a profound, unprecedented way. And again, Cliff mentioned a couple of just the new elements we have in the new executive order, but it still kind of goes to a couple of the core principles that those of us who've been working on environmental justice for a long time go back to over and over again, right? The idea that communities have a right to have a say in what happens to them. And the only way they can do that is by being involved in a decision that's going to impact their community. That involvement, though, isn't meaningful, and that word meaningful goes to, kind of the core way we look at EJ across the federal government. It's not meaningful if the decisions of government don't change, right? If it is not actually just. And when we're talking about justice, the equity things, I'm going to leave aside for a minute, but when we're talking about justice, we're talking about actually changing the systems and structures of government, fundamental change to how we govern, where we govern, what we use to govern. And again, going back to what Cliff just shared, right? We finally, just this past fall, with the support of Carleton Waterhouse, we signed out a new policy that updates the way that we approach emergency response at EPA, which is huge. It's going to take us some time to implement that. It has a lot of things to do with training, with personnel, with actually changing the structure of emergency response in EPA. We've been working to try to get that policy put in place since Flint. That was a little while ago, right? Flint was 6 years ago, 7 years ago. We've been working for a while to get that sort of policy changed. And it wasn't until this administration that somebody showed up and looked at it and was like, yeah, we should change that system. That's systemic change. So when you see those sorts of things, I know from, where I used to sit in a community-based organization down in Houston, I would look at those sorts of things and think, well, that's fun. You all spent your time doing that. It really does matter, right? That is the way you change the systems of government. So some of the other ways that we're changing the systems and structures of government is we're standing up a new program, right? We're actually just a couple weeks shy of the announcement by Administrator Regan down in North Carolina of the establishment of the Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights. That's a big deal, right? We took the EJ program, which had been around actually for almost exactly 30 years when this happened. We were celebrating our 30th anniversary last year. The EJ program at EPA was stood up for the first time in the fall of 1992. So in September of 2022, we took the EJ program, which was going through its own rapid expansion because of some appropriations, and we brought it together with the External Civil Rights Compliance Office, so the office that handles Title VI complaints and other civil rights requirements, along with our alternative dispute resolution program, which we call the Conflict Prevention and Resolution Center. And we created a new national program. That program stands shoulder to shoulder with the other programs at EPA, with Cliff's program, with the Office of Land and Emergency Management, with Chris's program, with the Office of Research and Development, with the Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance, with the air program, with the water program. Environmental justice and civil rights now stands shoulder to shoulder with them. That is structural change, right? We didn't inherit any new authorities, right? We still have to go to the air program to get the air program to advance EJ in air quality. We still have to go to the water program to get the water program, to work with the water program to advance environmental justice and what the water program does. But we now enter the room of the same, with the same stature. So when we are doing our work to advocate for environmental justice, for equity, for civil rights within EPA, we're now an equal program to those other programs. That's important. It's even more important to me, coming from Houston, that it's not just about, you know, what people in Washington, D.C. perceive, but it sent a really clear message through the entire environmental public health system of the United States, which is a federal system, or a federalist system, right? It's not just EPA, it is hundreds of other state and local agencies that actually implement our authorities to a great extent. It sends an unequivocal signal to them that for us to achieve our mission to protect the health and environment of everyone in the United States, of every community in the United States, environmental justice and civil rights compliance are core elements of that mission achievement. If you are not practicing EJ, if you are not complying with civil rights requirements, you are not going to achieve your mission of protecting the health and environment of this country. You know, and I think that's a really important part of the second thing you see here about some of the big policy priorities that we have at EPA that are real priorities for us in 2023. And this goes to, again, another systemic change that we achieved early in this administration is we finally got to write our own chapter in EPA's multi-year strategic plan. Multi-year strategic plan is about the least sexy thing that I can talk about in public, but it's really important, right? The multi-year strategic plan determines what we do. It determines what we ask Congress to fund. It determines how we rate and review every single person in EPA at the end of the year. Right? So having our own chapter in that multi-year strategic plan was a huge advance. It was a just change to our systems and structures. And we put some big things in there. The three biggest things are that we're going to have a cumulative impacts framework that finally brings the reality of communities that face multiple impacts. And I know Chris was speaking to this, that starts to bring that reality of the cumulative burden faced by communities from generations of being dumped on and being disinvested in and being marginalized, along with other things like psychosocial stressors, or the fact that those exact same communities are on the front lines of receiving the impacts of our changing climate. It's going to bring that reality into environmental public health protection, into permitting, into rule writing, into emergency response, into cleanups, into everything we do. We're finally going to have actual measures of eliminating the disparities that exist in the United States, right? The fact that if you're a Black child in this country, you likely have more lead in your blood. Or if you're a Hispanic child in this country, you probably are more likely to have asthma than other kids. Those disparities shouldn't exist. They're caused by the environment and who we have chosen through the decades to protect or not protect. So we're going to eliminate those sorts of disparities, and we're going to hold them up as public measures of how successful we are achieving our mission by advancing environmental justice through that mission achievement. We're also going to issue guidance on civil rights compliance. Right? EPA is very proud. One of our core principles from the very beginning, from 1970, when William Ruckelshaus first established the EPA, one of our core principles was we follow the law. We haven't always meant it, though. We followed the environmental laws. We still have a lot of work to do to follow the civil rights laws. So we're making advances on how to do that across everything that EPA does. And then the last thing, to get to kind of the equity piece that will lead to justice, is we are finally going to set up a holistic community support program by using both the Inflation Reduction Act And the majority of the funding that we're getting in an increased annual budget appropriation from Congress, we are finally going to set up a system that not only just does what the CARE program did. A lot of folks, ever since the CARE program went away, if you remember over a decade ago, over 16 years ago, what the CARE program was, I remember because I applied to it. I didn't get it, but I wanted the CARE program in for the communities we worked in Houston. We're going to do that with so much more to it. So wherever a community is on its journey, whether they are just starting out and they need help writing their first grant, laying out their first budget, engaging with their local government, figuring out which grant across the thousands of probabilities in the federal government or even through philanthropy should they be applying to, we're now going to have thriving community technical assistance centers or TICTACs out there providing that basic level of support. Later this year, we're going to announce the complement to the TICTACs, which are going to provide financial assistance through our EJ Thriving Community Grant Makers. So we're making it as easy as possible for communities to access the technical assistance they need and the financial assistance they need without having to come through federal acquisition processes, without having to apply for some really arcane, hard to understand grant, right? We're going to put it out there. We're going to have other forms of assistance that get more specialized, that do things like project development, planning support, figuring out the financial minutia of putting together big projects, all the way up to this October, we'll be announcing what we're calling our community change grants. And those community change grants are going to provide implementation level support to community-driven collaborative partnerships in the range of $10 to $20 million per award, so that we can actually start to fund the things from EPA's EJ program that will change conditions on the ground, right? That will unlock the potential for communities to start pulling down those other billions of dollars that Katie was talking about from the water infrastructure, that is going to make it more likely that those brownfields projects or those RCRA projects that Cliff Villa's program is responsible for, that they can come into their, or can come into the community. That whether it's DOT or USDA or HUD or Commerce or any of the other opportunities that are out there through such historic levels of appropriations, that we're going to put communities in a place to pull those resources into their communities, because their communities are the ones that need and deserve it the most. But we're going to take away that barrier to those communities being able to access those funds. So that opportunity should be coming out this October. We have a webpage up. If you just search for EPA Community Change Grant, we're finding that there are a number of community change grants out there in different parts of the United States, typically at smaller levels than what we're offering. But we now have a website that is dedicated with all the information that we can share publicly right now, some of which I just recited, is out there online, so that we can start actually getting folks ready to come in for those implementation level activities. The Thriving Community Technical Assistance Centers are all almost ready to open their doors. We're going to have more information coming out about that in the next couple of weeks, about where folks can go to get that help, as well as many other forms of help that we're going to have come out in the October, November timeframe to help folks even more effectively access these different forms and levels of support that we'll be offering. So thank you, Christy. I think that's where I will stop.
Terrific. Thank you so much. And our final presentation is Marian Engelman-Lado, Deputy General Counsel of Environmental Initiatives at EPA. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Christy. And I am not going to show slides. I'm hoping to get some energy going here at the end of the panel and play a little mop up. So I had the good fortune over the last year to help launch this new Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights program that Matt was speaking about, and we'll pick up some highlights of that experience and what we're doing. But want to start with just saying how much we have the wind at our sails as a result of being part of this administration. Picking up on something Cliff said, we have been directed by a number of executive orders to really advance environmental justice, to advance equity. And it's just exciting that all parts of the agency are involved in that. So the Office of General Counsel, to use but one more example, dug into our authorities to advance environmental justice. And what we looked at when we were developing our first equity plan, so under Executive Order 13985, signed by President Biden at the beginning of the administration, he asked us, each agency, to look at what are the barriers to equity. Well, what are the obstacles? And there were quite a number that we identified. And one was a reliance on sort of narrow legal interpretations without really digging into where are our areas of discretion, where are our areas of authority. And there had been a document that had been pulled together during the Obama administration called Legal Tools to Advance Environmental Justice. It was outdated. It was before, for example, the reform of the Toxic Substances Reform Act. So it just had to be updated. And also, we wanted to dig deeper. So the Office of General Counsel, together with our regional counsel across the country, created a process for reviewing the document and digging in with all the programs throughout the agency to say, where do we have either an explicit requirement to advance environmental justice or to take environmental justice into account as required by Executive Order 12898, or where do we have authority to do so? And we published, and you can find it online, Legal Tools to Advance Environmental Justice. And it's available not only for EPA, which is its primary audience, so we know that where we have authority, we can use that authority. It doesn't guarantee we'll use it. We may have resource issues, et cetera. But we are putting some energy into saying, no, that's not an excuse. In an area where we have the discretion, let's at least face up that we have that authority and figure out whether we can use it. And also for our partners, states, local governments, other stakeholders, it is really a great resource. And then we dug deeper. As people have been already talking about, Chris and Matt, we are really taking seriously the need to evaluate cumulative impacts and to address cumulative impacts in our decision making. And so we did an addendum to Legal Tools, which is a cumulative impacts addendum, which further looked at, it's not comprehensive, but it further looked at where do we have authority to consider and address cumulative impacts. And so that, again, is available to the public, it's available to all stakeholders, and is just a great resource. So that's just another example how all parts of our agency, the Office of Research and Development, OECA, our Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance, water, air, and of course, OEJ-ECR, the Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights, and OGC, the Office of General Counsel, we're all involved in this process. And as Matt said, launching the Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights helped to take issues of equity and environmental justice from the margins and really ensure that they're central, that they're at the table. So it's an unprecedented and exciting time. I wanted to answer one question in the chat and then focus on external civil rights in my couple of minutes. The question was, the administrator went on a journey for justice. What's the follow-up? And there is an email landing page online that you can look at about that very question. Because what we didn't want as an agency is to go to places and sort of just jump in. And the administrator's really dedicated to informing our policies and our programs in a way that that helps us to understand what he's seeing, what he's experiencing, and to listen to communities. And he's one person who's going out and engaging directly. So among other things, the administrator and EPA announced key steps such as unannounced inspections in areas, greater enforcement opportunities as appropriate. So really take a look at the website and hopefully that will be helpful in understanding what the follow-up to the journey to justice is. We're really recognizing that it's important for the whole agency to be translating these mandates and policies and executive orders into transformative change on the ground. So Matt mentioned our external civil rights compliance office. And I want to dig a little bit more deeply into some of the ways that we are enforcing civil rights. And this isn't easy. There's a long history of EPA's, I'll just say, failure to sufficiently enforce civil rights in the environmental sector. And I should say, Cliff did a great job talking about his background. I'm not going to spend as much time. But my own background is in civil rights enforcement. I just joined the administration on February 1, 2021. And I worked a lot on strengthening civil rights in the environmental sector, among other things. So what were some of the concerns? The concerns involved a lack of transparency, a lack of effective enforcement, failure to put out guidance documents, the very things that make an effective program. And we just hit the ground running. So let's start with transparency. We had our first listening session ever. That was a national listening session to get feedback on what this program should look like and what people's experiences were. And I should say our External Civil Rights Compliance Office enforces Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, and national origin by recipients of our funds. So it doesn't apply to EPA. We enforce the law as to recipients and sub-recipients of federal funds. So environmental agencies at the local and state level, anyone, it could be a private entity that receives EPA funding, any entity that receives EPA funding by and large. And we also enforce anti-discrimination law or civil rights law that applies to recipients of federal funds, that protects people with disabilities or people who are aging, and in a limited way against sex discrimination. So we had this first transparency listening session, and now the program is working with Matt and the offices that are our environmental justice offices to engage in quarterly participation in a national EJ community engagement call. So the level of transparency, of engagement, of running this program in a way that is consistent with environmental justice principles, of engaging communities, nothing about us without us, is really at a different level. We also have had engagement with the NEJAC. We've also put our docket online, and you can go to EPA's website and look for EPA Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 docket, and you'll come up with the public documents like complaints, closure letters. I will say, before coming to EPA, as someone who worked a lot on civil rights in the environmental justice sector, we had to FOIA EPA. We had to send Freedom of Information Act requests, or people would ask me, do you have these complaints? And now they're freely available through links on the website. We dramatically revised our pre-award review process. What does that mean? It means that when recipients of federal funds, before recipients of federal funds get federal money, they're supposed to ensure that they comply with Title VI. And so, and other civil rights laws. So they're supposed to ensure that they have language access, that they ensure public participation, that they have a grievance procedure, that they have someone who coordinates their civil rights office, that they collect data to make sure that they are in compliance with the law. So we strengthen that. And now if an applicant for EPA funding is not able to give us that assurance, we have a form online that they use, then we discuss that with them. We give them technical assistance, and they need to come into compliance before they get the funds. And we have entered into about 90 agreements already since January 1 of this year for compliance, and many of those agreements has already led to compliance. We've also, this sounds abstract, but it translates into language access at the community level. If there are public hearings around a permit, for example, and greater opportunities for meaningful engagement, among other things. We did our first compliance review, every agency. Now, I should say that it's not only EPA that has civil rights enforcement obligations. So does the Department of Ed, so does the Department of Transportation. And many of the other agencies have used their affirmative authority to initiate compliance reviews, not just wait till a complaint comes in, but actually say, we're hearing about a problem, we're going to look into it. And we started to do that last year. We initiated our first what's called compliance review. And that was in follow-up to a new guidance we put out that sets forth for everyone to see what our criteria are and our processes for making decisions about what compliance reviews will do. For the first time in decades, we're able to increase the number of staff from a sort of flat line of 12 for decades, 12 people to do all civil rights enforcement work across the whole government with some assistance from regions, but really very, very small. The president's budget really called for increasing that significantly. We got 16 last year, which is still a third higher, and then 22 or 23 this year. So we're almost at double what we started with. And we're doing training and engaging and onboarding people. The president's budget continues to call for more. And that's really important because we have a lot to do and we have an unprecedented volume of complaints, something like 2 times higher this year than ever before. We are integrating civil rights into the agency with trainings and workshops. We've helping recipients of our funds like state agencies anticipate that if they take money from our Office of Water or Office of Air and Radiation, that they're going to need to comply with civil rights law. And so we've integrated language about that into Office of Water, Office of Air and Radiation, and other guidance documents. We've provided a lot more information to recipients of funds about compliance. We've done workshops. We've done a lot of technical assistance. We put out a frequently asked questions document on frequently asked questions on taking into account environmental justice and civil rights in permitting, which is available online. We've also been super innovative in trying to ensure that our work is consistent with principles of environmental justice. And one example of that is we've engaged, Matt mentioned the Conflict Prevention and Resolution Center, which is just an amazing resource for EPA as a whole on facilitation and conflict resolution. And the External Civil Rights Compliance Office has engaged CPRC, the Conflict Prevention and Resolution Center, to really think about how do we ensure that we can get communities into the same room as the recipient of federal funds, as the state agency or the local government, because oftentimes trust has broken down. And EPA getting into an agreement with a state agency may cause the community actually to feel less empowered because they're outside the room when an agreement is made. How do we bring people together? So we have been piloting various approaches and we'll continue evaluating them and piloting them to bring people together. And I guess I'll sort of end on this, and I'm happy to talk about the executive orders and other things in our couple of minutes of Q&A. But I want to end on how important it is that we have the commitment and leadership from the president to the administrator on all of this work, the equity work, the environmental justice work, the civil rights work, which just translates into continued efforts on these areas. We had this first executive order on equity 13985, which caused us to develop an equity plan, which again is online, and it includes community-based participatory research. It includes strengthening our civil rights program. But President Biden realized advancing equity is not a one-off, that we need to constantly rethink what are the barriers and what can we be doing better. So he recently signed Executive Order 14091, which requires all of us, every agency, to examine the barriers to equity every year and develop a new strategy for advancing equity. And so we've been working on that, and they'll become public relatively soon. But that's important because there's a saying, freedom is a constant struggle, right? It doesn't end. We have to we can improve, and we have to address the disparities. We have to keep moving forward, but we have to keep improving. It's not a one-off. So the commitments from the highest level and at EPA from the administrator really are what helps to drive this. And we're trying to integrate it, as Matt said, into the structure of the agency, into our practices, so it will continue out into the future. Thanks so much. It's just a delight to be here.
Thank you so much. I'm going to ask the other speakers to come back on camera. Thank you. And we'll go through some of these questions here that have come in from the audience. And if you do have a question, we'll either try and get to it right now in the next 7 minutes, I think we have, or you can, I think you can email the symposium email address, and they'll connect the people who have answers to the people who have questions. So the first question I was gonna pose is in the chat, and it's for the Office of Water. And what about states that are purposefully not applying for the funds? And then there's a related question with an example of the state of Mississippi. And then there's a related question: are cities able to apply for those funds without state intervention?
Sure. So the Office of Water is working with states to encourage them to apply for these funds. And I think that progress is being made where there haven't been as early as signups. And it's important, right, for us to take advantage of this opportunity. So and that's a state's discretion, and I don't have tons more to say by that, besides that headquarters is happy to work with states. And in terms of, can cities apply without state support? So because the state revolving funds are administered at the state level, then accessing the dollars from the bipartisan infrastructure law are mainly through the state. So again, it's important to work with the states that as these projects are developed, they will be ranked highly and then prioritized, which are state decisions, in order to support them. But I think trying to support states as they're looking at the various levers that are in their control around how outreach works, how applications are accepted, how projects are ranked, how disadvantaged communities are defined, that those policy tools are underway, right? Many states are really working hard from an environmental justice lens to think about those mechanisms to advance justice.
There's another question about water. Do you mind responding to it while you're talking about how to address the drinking water needs of rural Alaskan villages? So
yes, that is trying to tailor, right, technical assistance to the whole country, right? And thinking about where are residents and what are the unique challenges that certain communities face based on where they are geographically, what the financial opportunities and constraints are. And so one great program that is a good resource is called the Rural Small Tribal Grants. And they're have been working with TA providers, and more are coming online who are working specifically with Alaskan communities. And so that's a good resource. But certainly thinking about communities that have not received public infrastructure funds in the past and might face additional challenges is really part of the design of the water technical assistance programs.
The next is a comment, and it's a really interesting thought. So it's more of a discussion, and it would be nice to all be together in one room, but I'm going to pose this thought anyway. Emergency preparedness and traditional ecological knowledge and wisdom would make a good pilot project. Does anyone want to have a discussion around that? Yes, thank you.
I mean, yeah, agreed. We could have a really long, intriguing discussion, but I'd say we're engaged in sort of this discussion in the field in many ways, including right now in Maui. I mentioned that we had some cultural awareness training, but the people, our EPA staff and contractors who've gone through this training and working directly with cultural resource observers have really been moved. And I think as a purely pragmatic response, their sensitivity has been heightened to the values and the depth of values that some Native Hawaiian communities hold. And I think that alone is value that will reflect in their work and reflect in sort of their future going forward. So, we're still we're still in the emergency response mode in Maui, but I think we're going to learn a lot sort of about human nature and behavior from experiences like that. And I look forward to reflecting on it as much as I look forward to just getting jobs done and getting communities back together as soon as possible.
Thank you. I think this question is a detailed question. Is Washington, D.C. included for all of this funding that was discussed? So I think this this is talking about the environmental justice funding that was presented on. Does anyone want to address that question?
I have one short answer. It
Sure.
is for the SWIFR funding, so for recycling funding, yes. But I also believe that it's a case by case, and we have to look closely at the statute and see what Congress authorized for individual programs, and there may be other answers from other offices.
It does get a little bit tricky sometimes when you're talking about territories, when you're talking about DC, when you're talking about we have other designations like the freely associated states. So sometimes you do have to be careful on a program by program basis. You know, in some instances, like as Katie was talking about with the SRF, the State Revolving Fund program, you know, Congress was very explicit who gets it. Sometimes, you know, especially in some of these appropriations that happen fairly quickly and have to go through a lot of processes on the Hill, specific words might just get left out, or they might hit the trash heap in a language change inadvertently. So you do have to look out for how and where folks can line up. And that is something in our grants, in the EJ grants, you know, Congress was very clear that for the EJ grants, it's community-based organizations or partnerships of a community-based organization with a tribe. And the language they used in the statute means a federally recognized tribe with a local government. And we can actually be, you know, fairly expansive with the interpretation of the local government all the way up to, you know, subunits. So like the air quality districts out in California would technically be local governments, not state governments, or an academic institution. So states weren't in there, territories weren't in there. So it really has to be, as Cliff said, you really have to be careful when you're looking at each program for what the eligible entities are to apply to that program. And again, that's one of the things that's the kind of support that the Thriving Community Technical Assistance Centers are going to provide to communities. You know, if a community is interested with something, they'll have the expertise to sit down and say, ooh, you know, y'all can't apply for this one, but there's this one over here. Or if you want this one, you got to go work with those folks. Let's give them a call and see if we can't get them to talk to you about maybe working in a partnership to go get that one, because then you'd be eligible. So you have to have some dexterity there between different programs.
Thank you. And we're going to wrap up. I want to really thank the presenters. I'm going to send us off with a very good question that we can't address, but we can walk away from this session with this question on our thoughts. So change for the future is great, but when communities have been historically and multi-generationally negatively affected, how do you address restorative justice? So we can go about our days with thinking about that, because that is one of all of our goals. Thank you so much. I hope you have a good rest of the symposium. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all.